He looked my father in the eyes and said I would be dead within a year. Not sick, not struggling, not lost or wandering or spiritually broken in the way he described people who left. Dead, the bishop of our community, the man who decided who was saved and who was lost, who could marry and who could be shunned, who belonged to God and who had turned their back on him, stood there in our living room in his black coat and his long beard and told my father that if I left, God would take me before the next harvest. My father believed him. I left anyway. And what came next changed every single thing I thought I knew about myself, about God, about family, and about what it means to survive something that was designed to make you feel like survival outside of it was impossible. What happened after I walked out of that farmhouse in Lancaster County at 19 years old with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes? $40 I had saved coin by coin over 3 years, and a phone number written on a scrap of paper that I had hidden inside my shoe for 2 months, is not the story I expected to be telling, but it is the one I have. And if you think you know what the Amish are, if you have driven past the horse and buggies on Route 30, if you have bought a quilt at a roadside stand, if you have watched one of the documentaries that frames the community as a quaint and peaceful alternative to modern chaos, I promise you that what I grew up inside was something that none of those images were built to show you. This is the full story. All of it. I was born on a Tuesday morning in April, the third of what would eventually be 9 children, in a farmhouse in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania that had no telephone, no electricity, and no running water when my parents moved into it. My father's family had been Amish for 5 generations, a fact he mentioned with the specific pride of a man who considered longevity within a tradition to be its own form of virtue, regardless of what the tradition required. His grandfather had farmed the same land, his great-grandfather before that. The Schrocks had been in Lancaster County since the 1800s, and the Schrocks, as my father understood it, would be in Lancaster County until the Lord came back for all of them. My mother was different. She had not been born Amish. She was the daughter of a Mennonite family from Ohio, a related but distinct community, less strict in some ways, more progressive in others, who had met my father at a regional gathering when she was 14 and he was 17. She had converted and joined the church at 16, which in our district was considered late. The standard was 14 or 15. 16 meant you had taken your time. It meant there were questions about the sincerity of your faith that would never fully be put to rest by anything you did afterward. There were women in our district who had known my mother for over 20 years and still occasionally made comments at quilting circles about her conversion age that were not quite criticisms, but were not quite nothing either. I understood later that this shaped her in ways that shaped me. My mother had chosen this life. She had come from somewhere else and made a deliberate decision to join it, which meant she could not allow herself to question it, because questioning would mean questioning a choice she had made publicly, permanently, at 16 years old, in front of a congregation that had watched her take her vows. The price of doubt for a convert is higher than the price of doubt for someone born into the tradition, because the convert has no history of inherited certainty to fall back on. Everything my mother believed, she had chosen to believe. And so she believed it harder than almost anyone I knew. My father was a dairy farmer. We had 40 cows when I was born, 62 by the time I left. The cows were the organizing principle of our entire family's existence. They had to be milked twice a day, every day, without exception, without delay, in all weather, including the winters that arrived in Lancaster County like a declaration of war and settled in for months without apology. My older brother Aaron was my father's primary assistant from the time he was 8 years old. My older sister Ruth handled most of the domestic labor that I later understood was simply assumed to belong to women and girls, without anyone ever saying so directly. And I, the third child, the second daughter, the one my mother once described as the one who watches, existed somewhere in between those two worlds, old enough to help with nearly everything, and young enough that nobody had yet decided exactly what role I was meant to fill permanently. We woke at 4:30 every morning. Not because anyone decided 4:30 was the right time, it was simply when the cows needed milking and the cows did not care about anyone's preferences. We ate breakfast before sunrise. We worked until the evening milking was done. We ate dinner. We read from the Bible or from approved devotional texts. We went to bed. This was not a schedule. It was a life. It was the only rhythm I knew for the first 16 years of my existence, and it was so complete and so consistent that the idea of a day organized differently would have required a kind of imagination I had not yet developed. The church was everything. I cannot say this strongly enough. Not the church in the way people who go to a building on Sunday mornings mean when they say that word. Not a weekly community gathering. Not a set of shared beliefs held loosely alongside everything else that fills a life. When I say the church was everything, I mean it in the most structural and literal sense possible. The church determined what clothes you could wear, the specific style, the specific color, the specific length of hem and sleeve. It determined what color your house could be painted. It determined whether you were allowed to use indoor plumbing, or rubber tires on your farm equipment, or a gas-powered generator for the milk cooling system that the English Dairy Board required, or buttons instead of hook and eye fasteners on your jacket. It determined who you could speak to, how long you could speak to them, in what context, and under what conditions. It determined who you could marry, not just that you had to marry within the church, which was the absolute floor of the requirement, but that the bishop and the congregation had significant informal influence over which specific pairings were considered appropriate and which were considered problematic for reasons that were never fully explained but were always clearly communicated. It determined what happened to your family's standing in the community if you stepped outside any of these parameters, intentionally or not. And above all of this, above every specific rule and every unspoken expectation, was the bishop. Our bishop's name was Eli. I will not give his last name here, and anyone who thinks they know who I am describing should understand that there are enough Elis in enough Lancaster County districts that I am not making his identification easy, and that is entirely intentional. He had been bishop since before I was born, which meant that for my entire conscious life. This man had been the final authority on every significant question that touched any of the 400 and some people who made up our district. He was not elected in any process that resembled a democratic vote. He was chosen by lot, a method in which candidates draw slips of paper from a pile, and the one who draws the marked slip is understood to have been chosen by God. The community genuinely believed this. They believed that God's hand was in the lottery. They believed that the man who drew the marked slip had been divinely appointed to his role, which meant that questioning the bishop's decisions was not just socially unacceptable or politically dangerous, it was understood at a foundational level as questioning God. Eli was not a physically imposing man. He was medium height, slightly built, with a gray beard that reached his chest and glasses that he wore pushed down on his nose in a way that made him look perpetually like he was peering over the top of them at whatever he was examining, which, as I grew older, I came to understand was precisely the impression he intended to create. He spoke quietly. He did not shout in sermons the way I later learned some preachers in other traditions did. He delivered his pronouncements in a tone that was almost gentle, a tone that made what he was saying feel less like a threat and more like a statement of inevitable fact. He was not a villain in the cinematic sense. He had no mustache to twirl. He had never, as far as I knew, been deliberately cruel to anyone for the pleasure of cruelty. He simply exercised total authority over a community that had given it to him completely, and he exercised it with the calm certainty of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved it. The first time I understood what that authority actually meant in practice, not as an abstract principle, but as a lived reality that could reach into a specific family and rearrange it. I was 11 years old. There was a family 3 farms over from ours named the Zooks. They had 6 children, the middle one of whom was a boy named Daniel, who was 16 when I was 11. Daniel was a reader. In our community, this was not unusual. We were all encouraged to read the Bible and appropriate devotional materials, and literacy was valued insofar as it served those ends. But Daniel read beyond those materials. He found English books at the second-hand sale that was held at the fire hall in the nearest town twice a year, where Amish families sometimes went to purchase household goods and farm equipment, and where the English organizers, not understanding the boundaries they were crossing, sometimes set out boxes of general paperback books for $0.25 each. Daniel bought books. He read them. He brought them home and read them in his room by candlelight after the rest of the family had gone to sleep. He also asked questions. He asked his father why the Ordnung, the unwritten but rigidly enforced code that governed every detail of community life, seemed to differ between districts if it truly came from God. He pointed out that the district 2 counties over allowed a different style of buggy than ours. He asked whether God had a preference about buggy styles, and if so, how 2 adjacent districts had reached different conclusions about what that preference was. He asked why the English farmers around them used electricity for their equipment and lived healthy and apparently God-fearing lives, and whether the rule against electricity was actually in the Bible or whether it was a decision that human beings had made at some point and then described as divine. These were not rebellious questions in any obvious sense. They were the questions of a curious and intelligent 16-year-old who read books and thought carefully about what he read. In any other context, in an English school, in a library, in a conversation with almost any adult outside our community, someone would have engaged with those questions seriously. Would have said, "Good point. Let me think about that." Would have treated the questions as the beginning of a conversation worth having. In our district, Daniel's questions were brought to Eli by his father within 2 weeks. What happened next was so ordinary within the logic of our community and so shocking in retrospect that I have thought about it more times than I can count. Daniel was not punished in any dramatic or obvious way. There was no public confrontation, no formal proceeding, no announcement from the bishop at Sunday service. What happened was quieter and more thorough than any of those things. Daniel was removed from the informal arrangement he had for completing his schooling. Amish children in Pennsylvania are legally permitted to leave school after 8th grade, and many of the older children in our district had informal arrangements for continuing their education in practical subjects and put to work full-time on his family's farm. The books that had been found in his room were removed. The quarterly trips to the second-hand sale were canceled for the Zook family. His movements were restricted in ways that were never formally announced, but were enforced through the cooperation of every other family in the district. If Daniel went somewhere he was not supposed to go, someone would mention it to his father before the end of the day. He was placed under a watching that was entirely invisible from the outside and completely inescapable from within. His questions stopped, not because they had been answered, because the environment he existed in had been restructured so completely that asking them became impossible. When Daniel turned 18, he left the community. He did it on a Tuesday, quietly, before the rest of his family was awake. He left a note that his mother found on the kitchen table when she came down to start breakfast. I do not know what the note said. Nobody told me. What I know is that from that day forward, Daniel Zook did not exist in any functional sense within our community. His name was not spoken at communal gatherings. His mother did not reference him in conversation. His siblings, when asked by anyone outside the district whether they had a brother, said they had 4 brothers and named the other 4. He had simply been removed from the record of their lives with the efficiency of something that had been planned rather than something that had happened. He simply ceased to exist. That is what the English world took people to. I was 12 years old when all of this concluded, and I understood it with perfect clarity. I understood what Daniel had done wrong. I understood what had happened to him as a consequence. I understood that the mechanism was not cruelty, it was erasure. And I understood, at 12, with the specific and terrible clarity of a child who watches rather than performs, that the line between belonging and not belonging in our community was not drawn where I had always assumed it was. I had always assumed the line was between doing bad things and doing good things, between obeying and disobeying in obvious ways, between the kinds of sins that everyone could see, lying, stealing, violence, the things the Bible named directly, and the behavior the church approved of. What I understood after Daniel was that the line was much simpler and much more frightening than that. The line was between believing and not believing. And the belief that mattered was not belief in God in any general or philosophical sense. It was belief in this specific district's interpretation of God, this specific bishop's authority, this specific ordnung's version of what a holy life looked like. Question any part of that specific system, and you were on the wrong side of the line. It did not matter how good you were in every other respect. It did not matter how hard you worked, or how kind you were, or how faithfully you showed up to every communal obligation. Question the system, and you would be erased. I was 12 years old, and I already knew I was going to be erased. Not immediately. Not openly. I knew it the way you know things at 12 that you cannot yet articulate. In the body. In the gut. In the specific quality of restlessness that certain knowledge produces when it is too large and too dangerous to be examined directly. I did not say anything to anyone. I went to the morning milking and the evening milking and the Sunday services and the quilting circles and the barn raisings. I did everything I was supposed to do. I did it competently and without complaint. And inside all of that performance of belonging, I carried the knowledge that I did not belong, and had never belonged, and was never going to be able to make myself belong no matter how hard or how long I tried. I did not have a name for this at 12, I only had the feeling. The book came later that same year, and it gave me something to put against the feeling. My mother had an English neighbor whose name was Carol Fenstermacher, a widow in her mid-60s who lived a half-mile down the road in a white clapboard house with a vegetable garden that was, by any measure, the finest vegetable garden in our immediate vicinity. Carol brought us vegetables every fall, arranged in cardboard boxes and left on our front porch with a note that always said the same thing. Hope this helps, from Carol, in handwriting so small and precise it looked like it had been printed by a machine. She had been doing this since before I was born. My mother accepted the vegetables with a gratitude that was genuine but carefully managed. Too much warmth toward an English neighbor was its own kind of problem, and my mother was always aware of what was being observed and by whom. Carol also occasionally left other things in the boxes, canned goods in years when her garden had produced more than she could use herself, a pair of boots in my size 1 fall that fit so perfectly they felt like something that had been made specifically for my feet, and that I wore until they had holes in both soles and still thought about for years afterward. Small things, practical, useful, chosen with a consideration that I recognized even as a child as the consideration of someone who was paying attention to what we actually needed rather than what she imagined we needed. The fall I was 12, she left a book. It was a paperback novel, about 300 pages long, with a woman's face on the cover and a title I cannot remember anymore no matter how hard I try. My mother set it aside on the mudroom shelf without examining it closely, which in retrospect was unusual. She was normally careful about anything English that entered the house. But that particular week, my father had had a difficult conversation with Eli about a fence line dispute with a neighboring property, and my mother was managing the aftermath of that, which consumed most of her attention. The book sat on the mudroom shelf under a stack of folded dishcloths for 3 weeks. I found it on a Thursday afternoon when I was looking for a cloth to wipe down the milk pails. I did not take it openly. I waited until I was certain no one was watching, tucked it under my apron, carried it to the barn, and sat in the corner behind the hay bales where the light came through a gap in the boards, and read the first 20 pages without breathing. It was a romance novel. I did not know that term at the time. I did not have a vocabulary for categorizing fiction by genre because fiction, as a category, was not a significant part of my reading experience. What I knew was that it was a story about a woman who made choices. She chose who she spoke to. She chose where she went. She chose what she thought about and what she said, and whether she stayed where she was or went somewhere else. When people in positions of authority over her made demands she disagreed with, she argued. Not always successfully, the story had conflict and setbacks and moments where she did not get what she wanted. But she argued. She expressed what she thought, out loud, to the people who had power over her, and sometimes she won, and sometimes she lost, and either way she remained herself throughout. I had never read anything like it. I had read the Bible through twice, by the age of 12, the King James Version, which was the approved text in our district. I had read devotional books and prayer collections and a history of the Amish church in America that my father kept on the shelf in the sitting room. All of these things were about submission, about yielding to God's will, which in practice meant yielding to the community's interpretation of God's will, which in practice meant yielding to the bishop. The woman in this novel did not yield to anyone unless she decided to, and she decided based on her own assessment of the situation rather than on the authority of whoever was asking. It was, I understood at 12, reading by the light that came through the gap in the barn boards, a fundamentally different way of being a person than anything I had been taught was available. I read the book twice in the next 2 weeks, always in the barn, always when I was certain I was alone. I memorized passages without trying to. I thought about the woman in the story at the evening milking and at Sunday service and at the quilting circles where the older women talked in Pennsylvania Dutch about the things older women in our community talked about, which was primarily other people's compliance or non-compliance with the expectations of the ordnung. I thought, she would not be at this quilting circle. She would be somewhere else. She would have chosen to be somewhere else. My mother found the book on a Sunday afternoon when she was reorganizing the mudroom shelves. She picked it up, looked at the cover for a moment, looked at me, and put it in her apron pocket without saying a single word. She never mentioned it again. I never mentioned it again. We both understood, in the way that mothers and daughters in enclosed communities understand things that cannot be said safely, exactly what had happened. But I had already read it twice, and the thoughts it had produced were already inside me, living alongside the knowledge I had absorbed from Daniel's erasure, and together those two things were building something in me that was going to need a long time and a specific set of circumstances to become visible. I was 14 when I stopped believing. I did not stop believing all at once. It was not a dramatic moment, not a crisis. Not the kind of night of the soul experience that religious conversion narratives, even the negative ones, tend to center. It was more like a tide going out. One day I noticed that the water was lower than it had been. Then, lower again. And eventually I stood at what had been the edge of the ocean and realized I was looking at sand. I did not believe in the Ordnung as a divine document. I had suspected this for years, but now I knew it. I did not believe that Eli's authority over our lives came from God in any meaningful sense. I did not believe that electricity was spiritually dangerous, or that a certain style of buggy was more holy than another, or that the specific length of my hem mattered to any force in the universe that was worth caring about. I believed in something. I want to be careful here, because I am not describing an atheist's conversion story, which is its own kind of narrative I am not trying to borrow. I believed in something when I was alone in the early morning, before the rest of the household was awake, when the light came sideways across the fields and the cows were quiet and the air was still, and the world felt enormous and specific all at once. I believed in whatever made that feeling happen. I just did not believe it was the same thing Eli described on Sunday mornings. I did not tell anyone, not my sisters, with whom I shared a room and who were close to me in the way you are close to people, when your entire world is the size of a farm and a district and an ordnung. Not my mother, who I loved in the specific and complicated way you love someone who is both your protector and your warden. I had seen what happened to Daniel. I had seen what happened to every young person in that district who expressed the wrong thought to the wrong person at the wrong moment. The community had a long memory and zero tolerance for doubt expressed openly. So I appeared compliant. I appeared compliant for 5 more years while I worked out how to leave. I was 16 when I met Jonas. He was from a neighboring district, the Millers, 3 miles east of us, a family with 7 children and a good reputation in the regional community. We met at a barn raising on a Saturday in late September, the kind of communal event where multiple districts came together to help a family that had lost a barn to fire the previous spring. There were over 100 people there. The men worked on the structure, the women organized the food and managed the children and talked in their careful, layered way about everything that was happening in every district represented. And the young people, the teenagers and the young adults who were not yet married and were therefore still in the social space between childhood and full adult integration into the community, existed in a kind of loose, supervised freedom that was more relaxed than the usual monitoring. I noticed Jonas because he was laughing at something that was not supposed to be funny. One of the older men had made a pronouncement about the proper technique for a specific type of joint in barn construction, and the pronouncement was delivered with the authority of someone who had been building barns for 40 years and expected no debate. Jonas, who was standing 6 feet from me and had clearly heard the pronouncement, turned to the young man next to him and said something in a voice too low for me to hear that produced in the young man next to him a brief, suppressed, very obviously involuntary laugh that he converted immediately into a cough. Nobody else noticed. I noticed. He caught me noticing, and instead of looking away the way you were supposed to, he looked back. For about 2 seconds longer than was appropriate. And then he went back to his work. That afternoon, during the break for the midday meal, he appeared next to me at the food table and said, without preamble, whether I had ever wondered what was on the other side of the ridge. The ridge he was referring to was the long, low line of hills visible from almost anywhere in our district, which marked the rough boundary between the farming valley we lived in and the territory beyond it. I had looked at that ridge my entire life. It was visible from the barn and from the kitchen window and from the field where I hung washing on the line. I had looked at it thousands of times. I told him I thought about it constantly. He nodded like this was the answer he had expected. He told me that from the other side of the ridge you could see the edge of a town called Intercourse. The name made him pause and almost smile, and that from the edge of that town you could see the parking lot of a grocery store where English people drove cars and bought things in, plastic packages, and that he had once stood at the fence line of the property that bordered the store's parking lot and watched the cars for almost an hour before his father noticed he was gone. I asked him why he had stopped watching. He said his father had asked him what he was doing, and he had said he was looking at the cars, and his father had said there was work to be done, and he had gone back to work. And then he looked at me with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite something else, and said, "But I still think about the cars." We talked for the rest of that afternoon. We talked at every communal gathering for the next 6 months. It was not a secret exactly. In our community, the social interactions between young unmarried people were observed as a matter of course, and Jonas and I were observed. But we were not yet at the stage where the observations would generate any official attention, and so we had a period of something that resembled freedom, which is to say, we had conversations that the community could see us having, but could not quite hear the content of, and the content of those conversations was the most honest thing I had said to another person in 4 years. We did not say, explicitly, that we were leaving. We did not make plans or promises or declarations. What we did was talk to each other about what we actually thought, and what we actually thought was that we were not going to be able to stay. We talked about the Ordnung. We talked about what we believed and what we did not believe. We talked about Daniel, whose departure had been 5 years earlier, and whose absence was still a present fact in the community in the way that absences become when they are enforced rather than natural. We talked about the ridge and what was on the other side of it, and what was on the other side of that. Jonas was 18 when he left. I was 17. One Sunday he was at service, and 3 weeks later he was not there, and his family said, when asked, that he had gone to help a cousin in another state. In our community, this was a recognized formulation. It meant, "He has left, and we are not going to say so directly." Everyone understood this. Nobody said so. I found out through the underground, the informal network of whispers and carefully worded messages that moved between young people in leaving situations across multiple districts, that Jonas had made it out. That he was in Ohio, working construction. That he had tried to send me a message through a third party and the message had been intercepted by my father before it reached me. That he had not tried again, because he did not want to make my situation more difficult than it already was. I did not receive that message. I found out about it 2 years later, by which point I was already gone myself and sitting in a coffee shop in a small city 3 states away from Lancaster County, and when the woman who told me described the message Jonas had tried to send, which was, apparently, simply, "I am okay. And I hope you are okay, and I hope you make it out," I sat for a moment with the specific weight of knowing that someone had thought of me at a moment when I needed to know that and had been prevented from saying so. And then I ordered another coffee and talked about something else. After Jonas left, I became very quiet inside in a way I had not been before. Not sad, exactly, though it was sad. Quiet in the way of a decision that has been fully made and is waiting for the conditions to execute it. I had known before Jonas that I was leaving, The conversation in my head had been happening since I was 12, since Daniel, since the book, since 14 when I stood at the edge of what I no longer believed and looked at the sand. Jonas had simply been the person who confirmed that the conversation was not crazy, that other people were having it too, that the thing I was planning was possible because he had done it, and he was okay, and Ohio existed, and construction jobs existed, and the world on the other side of the ridge was not, in fact, going to kill me before the next harvest. What I did not have was a plan. And here is where I need to explain something that I do not think people who have not grown up inside a closed religious community fully understand, which is that leaving is not a decision. Leaving is a logistics problem. The decision is the easy part. I had made the decision at 12. The logistics took 7 years. I had no identification that I controlled. I had been born at home, which was common in our district, attended by a midwife rather than a hospital, and my birth had been registered with the county. Amish families do register births, despite the common misconception that they do not. But the documents that resulted from that registration were kept by my parents, not by me. I had a social security number that had been issued at my birth and that existed somewhere in a government file, but I had never seen the card and did not know the number. I had no driver's license, for obvious reasons. I had no bank account. I had never used a telephone independently. I had an 8th grade education that had focused almost entirely on practical skills, farm management, basic arithmetic as applied to farm accounting, Pennsylvania Dutch literacy, English literacy sufficient for interaction with the outside world in limited contexts, and essentially no academic preparation for anything the English world considered standard employment. All of this was not accidental. I want to be clear about this because I think it is one of the most important things I have to say. The practical conditions of life in our community, the lack of documentation, the lack of financial resources, the lack of external social connections, the limited education, were not simply the byproducts of a lifestyle choice. They were, whether or not any individual within the community thought of them this way, the conditions that made leaving extremely difficult and staying extremely rational. A person who has no money, no ID, no bank account, no driver's license, no phone, no contacts outside the community, and an education that does not translate into the outside job market is not a person who can easily walk away from the one system that will feed and house them. The dependency was not incidental. The dependency was the architecture. I understood this at 19 in a way I had not fully understood it at 12 or 14 or 17. And I made the decision, the second decision, the one that came after the original decision and required the original decision to have happened, that I was going to solve the logistics problem regardless of how long it took. I started saving money the fall after Jonas left. This required a level of patience and creativity that I am genuinely proud of in retrospect, though at the time it simply felt like necessity. There were coins from errands where I was handed more than the exact amount and not asked for change back, which happened rarely but did happen. Coins from returning glass bottles to the small store at the edge of our district, which was an errand I volunteered for whenever the opportunity arose. Bills, occasionally, from English visitors who pressed money into the hands of Amish girls who helped with something on their property, or gave them directions, or helped them find what they were looking for at the regional market. A form of tipping that the adults in my community generally discouraged, but that occurred regardless of discouragement. I kept the money in a tobacco tin that had belonged to my grandfather, which I hid inside a cloth bag inside a gap in the stone foundation of the barn, behind the spot where the third fence post from the left met the wall. In 3 years, I saved $43 and some change. I know how small that sounds. I know what $43 is worth in the English world. And I knew even at 19 that it was not enough to sustain me for any meaningful length of time. But it was not supposed to sustain me. It was supposed to get me far enough away from the farm to make the phone call that would start the next part of the process. The phone number came to me about a year after Jonas left, from a girl named Hannah, who was 2 years older than me and from a district about 20 miles north. Hannah and I had met at a regional quilting event that drew from multiple districts, and we had one of those conversations that happen sometimes between people who are similarly situated, careful, layered, full of spaces where neither person says the thing they are thinking, but both people know that the other person is thinking it. At the end of the quilting event, as we were separating to go back to our respective families, Hannah pressed a small folded piece of paper into my hand and said nothing. The paper had a name and a phone number on it. The name was Sarah. Below the phone number, in Hannah's small and very neat handwriting, were 3 words: "She will come." I put the paper in my shoe, not symbolically, literally in my shoe, tucked under the insole on the right side, where it stayed for 2 months, while I thought about what I was doing and whether I was truly ready to do it and what would happen to my family once I was gone, and whether my mother would be treated worse by the community because of my departure, and whether my younger sisters would have their options narrowed by being related to a girl who had left, and whether my father would be publicly shamed at a Sunday service, and whether any of that was my responsibility to prevent. I decided that I could not prevent any of it. I decided that waiting to leave until the consequences of leaving were 0 was the same as never leaving. And I decided that the life I was preserving by staying, the life of a young woman who did not believe in what she was required to believe, who would be expected to marry within the community and have children within the Ordnung, and spend the next 60 years performing a faith she had stopped having at 14, was not a life I could sustain without becoming someone I was not willing to be. I decided to leave in the spring, and then something happened that pushed the timeline forward, and the thing that happened was the bishop's visit. Eli had visited our home twice in the 3 months before I left. This was unusual. The bishop visited families in crisis, in the event of illness, death, serious breach of the Ordnung, or conflict that required his mediation. We were not in any of those situations overtly. My father's fence dispute had been settled. No one in our family was ill. There had been no public incident. And yet Eli came and sat in the sitting room and spoke to my parents in the low and specific tone he used when he was making it clear that he was paying attention to something, and the something he was paying attention to was me. I do not know what he had been told or by whom. Someone had said something to someone. I had been careful. I thought I had been careful, but communities that small and that interconnected do not require carelessness. They only require proximity. Someone had noticed something about the way I talked, or the way I did not talk, or the way I looked at something, or the way I failed to look at something I should have been looking at with the appropriate expression. Communities like ours are extraordinarily skilled at reading the subtle signs of internal dissent. They have been practiced at it for generations. The very structure of the community, the communal events, the interdependency, the constant visibility, is partly a social system and partly a monitoring system, and the two functions are completely integrated. You cannot participate in the community without being observed by it. Eli's second visit ended with him talking to my father privately in the barn for 45 minutes. I do not know everything that was said. I know that afterward my father was quieter than usual for several days. I know that my mother looked at me in a specific way during those days, not accusingly, not warmly, something in between, something that I recognized as the look of a person who knows what is coming and has no power to change it and has decided to simply be present for it. And I know that my father, on the fourth day after Eli's visit, came to find me in the barn during the afternoon chores and stood in the doorway for a moment and then said, without looking directly at me, "The bishop is concerned about you." I said, "I know." He stood there for another moment. Then, he said, "He wants to meet with you privately." Before the summer service. I said, "When is the summer service?" He said, 6 weeks. That night I called Sarah from the phone at the end of the road. I had known about the phone, a payphone that had been there for decades, technically accessible to community members for necessary communication with the English world, monitored by the social pressure of the community rather than any formal rule, and I had never used it. I walked to it at 9 in the evening, while there was still enough ambient light that I would not need a lantern, which would have been visible from the house. I dialed Sarah's number from memory. It had been inside my shoe for 6 months, and inside my head for longer. She answered on the third ring. I said, "My name is not important." "I got your number from someone who said you would come," she said. "Where are you?" I told her the road I was on and the approximate distance from the nearest town. She said, "I can be there in 40 minutes if you can be ready to go tonight." I had not planned for tonight. I had planned for next week, after I had had more time to think through every variable. After I had finished the letter I was writing to my mother that I intended to leave on the kitchen table, after I had allowed myself one more Sunday service to make sure I was certain. All of that planning dissolved in the moment she said tonight, because I understood suddenly that more time was not going to make the variables cleaner, and the letter was not going to make my mother grieve less, and one more Sunday service was not going to produce a certainty that I already had. I said, "I need 2 hours." She said, "I will be there." I walked back to the farm. I completed the evening chores because leaving the chores undone would have been noticed immediately, and I wanted to be gone before anyone noticed anything. I ate dinner with my family. I sat at the table that I had sat at for 19 years, and I ate the food my mother had made, and I listened to my father read from the Bible the way he read every evening, and I watched my younger siblings in the specific way you watch people when you know you are looking at them for the last time for a long time, and you are trying to record them accurately. Trying to see them as they actually are, rather than as the grief of leaving them is already making them seem. I went to bed at the usual time. I lay in my room until I heard my parents' door close, and then I lay for another hour until the house was fully quiet. Then, I got up. I had packed a garbage bag 3 days earlier, quietly, over the course of several evenings, taking items a few at a time so that nothing obvious was missing at once, and hidden it under the floorboards of the barn, next to the tobacco tin. I had 62 cents in my pocket. I had the remaining $40 in the tobacco tin. I had the phone number memorized. I walked out of my room and down the stairs. The stairs creaked on the third step from the bottom, which they had always done, and which my father had been meaning to fix for years. I stepped over that step. I went through the kitchen without turning on any light. I knew the kitchen by feel, by the specific geography of a room I had inhabited for 19 years. I went out the back door, which I closed behind me slowly enough that the latch did not make its usual click. I crossed the yard. The night was clear, and the moon was past full but still bright enough to see by. The cows were quiet in the barn. The house was dark behind me. I went into the barn and got the garbage bag from under the floorboards and the tobacco tin, and I put the money in my apron pocket, and I stood in the barn for a moment in the dark, and the smell of cows and hay, and the specific thick warmth that large animals produce, and I thought, this is the last time I will stand in this barn. Then I left. I did not look back at the house. This is the thing I have been asked about most often by people who want to understand what leaving felt like, and I have told the truth every time. I did not look back. Not because I did not love the people inside the house. Not because I was not frightened or grieving or aware of everything I was losing. I did not look back because I knew, with a certainty that I have never doubted since, that if I looked back I would not be able to keep walking. And I had been working toward this walk for 7 years. I had hidden money in a tobacco tin for 3 years, and a phone number in my shoe for 6 months, and I had sat at the dinner table 90 minutes earlier watching my family and trying to record them accurately. I had done all of the looking I was going to do. The time for looking was over. I walked to the end of the road and called Sarah. She arrived in 37 minutes. A dark blue car, American-made, with one headlight slightly dimmer than the other. She was a woman in her mid-30s, small and quick-moving, with short hair and jeans, and a manner that was efficient without being cold. She opened the trunk for the garbage bag without being asked. She did not say anything when I got into the passenger seat. She drove. After about 10 minutes, when we were past the boundary of our district and into the English road system, she said, "Are you hurt?" I said, "No." She said, "Are you hungry?" I said, "A little." She reached into the back seat and handed me half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper without taking her eyes off the road. I ate it. It was ham and cheese and mustard, and it was the most ordinary food imaginable, and I ate it in the dark of that car, on a road I did not recognize, and I cried for the first time since I had made the decision to leave, quietly, in a way I hoped she could not hear, which she probably could hear, and which she said nothing about. She drove me to a house in a small town 40 minutes from Lancaster County. The house was ordinary in every external detail. A 2-story rental in a neighborhood of 2-story rentals, with a small porch and a yard that was mostly brown grass and a mailbox that said 14A. Inside, it was warm and lit by electric lights that seemed extraordinarily bright to me after 19 years of candlelight. And there were 2 women in the kitchen when Sarah brought me in, both of them young, both of them former Amish from districts I did not know, both of them looking at me with an expression I could not immediately identify, but later recognized as, "We know exactly what you have just done. Because we have done it too." One of them made tea, the other showed me where the bathroom was, an indoor bathroom with a flush toilet and a sink with running hot water, which I had used in English public facilities before but had never had access to inside a home, and told me I could shower if I wanted to. I showered for 25 minutes in the hottest water I had ever stood under. I put on the clothes Sarah had told me to bring, which were English clothes, jeans and a t-shirt and a sweatshirt, which I had purchased one at a time at the second-hand sale and hidden at the bottom of the garbage bag under everything else. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. I looked like a person who had somewhere to go. The bishop's prediction was delivered to my father the following week, when my parents went to Eli to report my absence formally. They had waited a week. I learned later that they had spent the first 2 days expecting me to come back, then 3 more days managing the information within the family before they could no longer avoid the formal report. Eli met with my parents in the church house, which was the home of the family that hosted service that month, and he told them what he told families in this situation. He said that young people who left the community without baptism and without proper spiritual guidance were cutting themselves off from the protection that the community and the church provided. He said the world outside was not equipped to care for people who had been raised in the grace of the Ordnung. He said that he had seen this many times and that the outcomes for those who left before they were spiritually prepared were consistently poor. He said that I would not survive a year in the English world. I found out about this 3 months later from Hannah, who had heard it from her cousin, who had heard it from someone in our district who had been present. By the time the information reached me, I was living in a rented room in a city 2 states from Lancaster County, had obtained a state ID card using my birth certificate, which Sarah had helped me acquire through a process I will not detail here, but which involved the county records office and a significant amount of patience, and had been working for 6 weeks at a restaurant kitchen, doing prep work for $8 an hour, which was the first money I had ever earned that was mine to keep. I was not dead. I was not sick. I was not, as far as I could determine, in the process of being claimed by God as punishment for leaving the Ordnung before taking baptism. I was, for the first time in my conscious life, exactly as afraid as the situation warranted, and no more afraid than that. Not afraid of an additional invisible punishment on top of the visible difficulties. Just afraid of the visible difficulties, which were considerable and real, and which I was managing at the rate of 1 day at a time, in the way that you manage things when the alternative to managing them is not surviving them. The year I was 15, there was a wedding in our district that I have thought about more times than any other single event from my childhood, more than the barn raisings, or the harvests, or the Sunday services, or even the quilting circles where the older women said the quiet, devastating things they said. It was the wedding of a girl named Mary Byler, who was 17 years old and was marrying a man named Abe Stoltzfus, who was 31. This was not unusual in our community. The age gap was on the larger side, but not outside the range of what occurred regularly, and nobody mentioned it as a notable fact, not publicly. Not at the wedding itself, where over 200 people ate the food and sang the hymns and witnessed the vows. What I noticed, and what I have thought about ever since, was Mary's face. She was not unhappy in any obvious way. She was not crying or resistant or visibly frightened. She was performing the ceremony correctly and eating the food and talking to the people who spoke to her. But I watched her face through the entire day the way I watched everything, quietly, from the outside edge of the event, and what I saw was the face of a person who was doing a thing because it was the thing that was going to happen, not because it was the thing she had chosen. There is a specific quality to that kind of face, a kind of flatness underneath whatever expression is being performed. A quality of someone who has stopped arguing with a situation and has arrived at a place beyond argument, which is not the same as peace. I was 15. I did not have the language for what I was seeing. I had the seeing, and the seeing went into me alongside everything else that was accumulating in there, and 3 years later, when I was planning how to leave, I thought about Mary's face on her wedding day, and I thought, that is what staying looks like. That specific quality of someone who has stopped arguing with a situation. I did not want that face. I did not want to get there. I had already, at 15, been identified as a plausible match for several young men in the district, a fact that was communicated to me not directly, but through the specific way my mother sometimes steered conversations at communal events, and the specific way certain families positioned themselves near ours. This was normal. This was how it worked. I was a healthy young woman from a respectable family, with a good work record and no obvious strikes against me, and the community process for identifying potential matches operated continuously, invisibly, in the background of every social interaction. By the time you were formally asked, the answer was expected to be yes. The question was less a question than a formality attached to a decision that had already been made by the community on your behalf. I was 15 when I understood that if I did not leave, this was going to happen to me. That I was going to be Mary at my own wedding, performing correctly, talking to the people who spoke to me. And the face underneath the performed face was going to be the face of someone who had stopped arguing with a situation that I had never agreed to in the first place. There was also the question of Rumspringa, which I should explain because it is the thing people outside the community ask about most often when I describe where I came from. Rumspringa, which translates roughly from Pennsylvania Dutch as running around, is the period during which Amish teenagers are permitted a degree of freedom to experience the outside world before making the formal decision to be baptized into the church or to leave. In the popular imagination, this involves young Amish people going to parties, wearing English clothes, driving cars, living a kind of compressed adolescence outside the Ordnung before returning to be baptized and settle into Amish life. The reality, at least in our district and in the districts I knew of in our region, was considerably more controlled than the popular version suggests. The freedom of Rumspringa was real, but bounded. You could wear English clothes some of the time, in some contexts. You could attend events that were not strictly Amish. You could interact with English people with somewhat less restriction than usual. What you could not do, at least without significant social consequences that extended to your family, was behave in ways that indicated you were seriously considering not returning. The purpose of Rumspringa, as it operated in practice, was not to give young people a genuine choice. It was to give young people the experience of the outside world in a sufficiently bounded and managed way that they would return to the church with a sense of having chosen it, rather than having simply never seen anything else. This is not a cynical interpretation. I have heard it described this way by people who went through Rumspringa and returned to the church and are happy in the church. They describe it as the moment they chose their faith rather than inherited it, and for them that description is true and meaningful. The choice they made was real, but the conditions under which it was made, the monitoring, the family pressure, the social costs of continued absence, the practical difficulty of actually leaving permanently were not neutral. The scale was not even. And for those of us for whom the answer was genuinely no, Rumspringa was not freedom to explore. It was a test designed to produce a specific result, and we were the anomalous outcomes the test was not designed to accommodate. I went through Rumspringa at 16. I wore a pair of jeans once, borrowed from the girl who would later give me Sarah's number. I attended a bonfire in an English field with a group of young people from several districts. I sat at the edge of the fire and watched the English teenagers who were also there, friends of someone's cousin, who had been invited and who treated the whole thing as a curiosity, and I tried to imagine being them, moving through the world with the specific ease they had, and I could not do it. Not because I did not want to. Because the distance between who they were and who I had been made into was so large that I could not see the bridge from where I was standing. That night was the clearest I had ever been about leaving. Not inspired by the jeans or the bonfire or the English teenagers, I want to be precise about this because the story people want is usually simpler. The clarity came from the distance, from sitting at the edge of something I could see but not reach, and understanding that the gap between those two conditions was not going to be bridged by wearing jeans once or attending one bonfire. The gap was structural. The gap was in the architecture of who I had been made into, and the only way to close it was to leave the architecture entirely and build something else from different materials. The first year was the hardest and the best simultaneously. Nobody tells you this. Everyone who has not left an enclosed community imagines that the leaving is the hard part and that everything after is relief. And everyone who has left an enclosed community and is being honest with you will tell you that the leaving is the beginning of a different kind of difficulty that coexists with the relief in a way that is genuinely disorienting. I had to learn to open a bank account, which required identification I was still in the process of assembling. I had to learn to use a credit card, which required having a bank account first. I had to learn to drive, which I did at 21, 3 years after leaving, because the logistics of getting a driver's license without a prior license required having a state ID first, and getting a state ID had required getting the birth certificate, and all of it had taken time I had not anticipated. I had to learn what I believed about God and community and family outside of the only context in which those words had ever had meaning for me. I had to learn that doubt was not the same as wickedness, and that questions were not the same as rebellion, and that the fact that I had stopped believing at 14 in the specific version of faith the Ordnung required did not mean there was nothing to believe in. I also had to learn that the outside world, which I had been told my entire life was a spiritual and physical death trap, was full of ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives who had no particular interest in my destruction. The English world was not, in fact, trying to kill me. It was mostly trying to get to work on time and figure out what to have for dinner and manage the specific small difficulties of lives that were not mine but were recognizable as lives, which was itself a kind of revelation. The education question is something I return to often when I talk about what leaving required. In Pennsylvania, Amish children are legally exempted from compulsory education beyond 8th grade, based on a 1972 Supreme Court ruling called Wisconsin v. Yoder that determined the state's interest in compulsory education past that point was outweighed by the Amish community's religious interest in raising their children within the community without outside interference. The ruling is legally significant and frequently cited in discussions of religious freedom. From the inside of an Amish community, what it meant practically was that I stopped having any formal education at 14, and that the education I had received before that point was designed primarily to equip me for life within the Ordnung rather than for any mobility beyond it. I could read well. I could write clearly, though my written English had gaps that became apparent when I started writing things that required a vocabulary I had not needed before. I could do arithmetic at the level required for farm accounting. I could sew, preserve food, manage a dairy operation, care for animals, and organize a household more competently than most people I have since met who learned those skills voluntarily as adults. What I could not do was apply for most jobs in the English world without immediately running into the question of education credentials, which I did not have. I could not take a general equivalency diploma test without first learning material I had never been taught. I could not enroll in community college without a GED or high school diploma. I was 22 before I passed my GED. 24 before I took my first community college class. 27 before I completed an associate's degree in something I am not going to name here, because the specifics of my professional life are not the point. What the education gap meant in the first years after leaving was that I existed in the part of the English economy that did not require credentials, restaurant kitchens, cleaning services, agricultural work, the kind of physical labor that trades on skill and reliability rather than documentation. I was good at all of this because I had been doing physical labor since I was old enough to hold a milk pail, and I was reliable because reliability had been trained into me so completely that the concept of not showing up to something I had committed to was genuinely alien. I earned enough to live. I did not earn enough to do anything else for several years. I am not telling this as a complaint. I am telling it because I think the education gap is one of the most significant and least discussed aspects of what leaving an Amish community actually costs. The community's educational system is designed to produce people who can function within the community and cannot easily function outside it. This is not an accident. This is the design. And the cost of that design is borne almost entirely by the people who leave. There is a woman I met 3 years after leaving who had grown up in a different kind of closed community, not Amish, a fundamentalist Christian group in the Southeast, with different specific rules but similar structural logic, and we had a conversation once that I have returned to many times since. She said that the hardest thing about leaving was not learning how the outside world worked, which was difficult but learnable. The hardest thing was learning how to want things. Inside a closed community, wanting is managed carefully. There are approved wants: the want for a good harvest, for a healthy family, for spiritual progress, for the community's well-being. There are unapproved wants, which are wants that point outside the approved world. Those unapproved wants are managed through a combination of theology, which frames them as sin or temptation, and social structure, which makes the expression of them dangerous. Over time, inside a well-designed system, you stop having the unapproved wants with any force or consistency. They do not disappear. Nothing disappears. Everything that is suppressed goes somewhere. But they become quiet, then quieter, then almost inaudible under the weight of everything you have been taught to want instead. And then you leave, and the management of your wanting stops, and you are suddenly in a world of infinite options that you have been trained not to want, and the first task is not choosing, it is learning how to want again. Learning that you are allowed to want. Learning that the wanting is not sin. Learning that the specific wants you have, which are yours and not anyone else's, are valid and real and worth pursuing, rather than suppressed and managed and eventually silenced. I wanted, at 22, in the second year after leaving, to read every book I could find. I wanted to read novels and history and science and philosophy and things with no practical application whatsoever. I wanted to learn things simply because they were interesting, not because they were useful to the Ordnung or the farm or the community. I wanted to go to places I had not been. I wanted to know what the ocean sounded like because I had never been near one and I was 22 years old. I wanted, in a way that felt almost physical in its intensity, to choose. I went to the ocean for the first time when I was 23. I drove myself to a beach in Delaware that someone at work had mentioned, parked in the lot, walked across the sand, and stood at the edge of the Atlantic Ocean and listened to it for a long time. The bishop had told my father I would be dead before the next harvest. I was 23 years old, standing at the edge of an ocean I had chosen to visit, in a life I had built from $40 and a phone number. I was not dead. I was not even struggling particularly in that moment. I was standing at the edge of an ocean, which I had wanted to do since I did not know when, since some undateable point in my childhood when the wanting for things beyond the ridge had first become a permanent feature of my interior life. I stood there for a long time. The sound the ocean makes is exactly what I had imagined, and also completely unlike anything I had imagined. Both true simultaneously. I thought that was probably true of most things in the English world. I got back in the car and drove home and went to work the next morning. The second year after leaving was in some ways harder than the first, which is also something nobody tells you. The first year has the momentum of the decision behind it. Everything is new and difficult and terrifying in ways that keep you moving simply because stopping is not an option when you are still in the process of assembling the basic infrastructure of a life: the ID, the bank account, the job, the housing, the routine. There is no time to feel the loss of what you have left because you are too busy managing the emergencies of what you have arrived in. The second year, the emergencies become less frequent. The infrastructure stabilizes. And in the space that opens up when you are no longer managing a daily crisis, the grief arrives. I grieved for my family in the second year in ways I had not allowed myself to in the first. I grieved for my mother specifically. for the version of my mother who existed in a farmhouse in Lancaster County, making the food and doing the work and watching the world in the way she had always watched it, the way I had learned to watch it from her. And who was doing all of this without me in it, and who had not called, and who I could not call. I grieved for my younger sisters. I grieved for the specific quality of the early mornings on the farm, the sound of the cows, the smell of the barn, the way the light came across the fields at a certain hour of the day, in a certain season that I had never named but had known my whole life, and that I was not going to feel again in the same way. I grieved for the version of my life I was not going to have. Not the Amish version. I did not grieve for that, but some hypothetical version in which the family I came from was the family I could keep, in which loving them and living my life were not mutually exclusive conditions. This grief was real, and I am not going to minimize it by calling it the price of freedom or some other formulation that makes loss into a transaction. I lost things when I left. The loss was real. The things I gained were also real. Neither cancels the other. Both are true simultaneously, and the living of a life after a major rupture is, in my experience, the ongoing management of those two truths coexisting rather than the resolution of one by the other. I called Sarah once a month for the first year, and then less frequently after that as I became more capable of navigating the things that had been terrifying at first. She had built her network over 4 years, and in that time she had helped 11 women leave their districts. Not all of them stayed gone. 2 went back within the first 6 months, which she had told me was common, and which she described without judgment as their choice to make. Some of them she was still in contact with. Some of them she was not. She did not keep a ledger of outcomes. She simply answered the phone when it rang and drove when she said she would drive and made tea when there was someone sitting in her kitchen who needed tea. My father came looking for me in the first weeks. He found Sarah's house. I do not know how, whether someone in the network told someone who told someone, or whether he simply drove slowly through the nearest English towns, looking for something he could not name. Sarah told me he sat in the yard for 45 minutes one afternoon while I was at the house, in his truck, with his hat in his hands. She said he did not get out of the truck. He did not knock on the door. He sat there the way a person sits when they have driven to a destination without knowing what they were going to do when they arrived, and after 45 minutes, he drove away. I was inside the house the whole time. I knew he was there because Sarah told me quietly when I came downstairs. I stood in the kitchen and she told me, and I stood there for a minute, and then I asked if I could have more tea, and she made more tea, and neither of us said anything else about it. He did not come back after that. Or if he did, it was when I was not there, and Sarah did not tell me. My mother called 4 years after I left. She used a neighbor's phone, an English neighbor who, I understood later, had agreed to help her and kept it private in the way that English people who live near Amish communities sometimes agree to help and keep things private. My mother had 11 minutes. She had calculated this based on when my father was expected home, and she called with 11 minutes to spare. And she talked for 9 of them. She told me she loved me. She said she thought about me every single day. She said she could not come to see me. She said this, directly, without pretense, without the construction that might have made it sound like a free choice rather than a constraint. She said she could not come, but that she needed me to know the 2 things she had just said. She told me my younger sister had gotten engaged, which meant I would have a niece or nephew eventually that I would not be allowed to know. She told me the cows were fine. She told me my father did not know she was calling. And then she said she had to go, and she said goodbye in a way that people say goodbye when they do not know when they will speak again, and the call ended. I have not spoken to my father. This is the part of the story that I find people respond to most intensely, more than the bishop's prediction, more than the leaving, more than the garbage bag and the $40 and the 37-minute wait at the end of the road. People want to know about my father. They want to know whether I have forgiven him, whether he has tried to reach me, whether I am angry or sad or at peace with the silence that exists where a relationship is supposed to be. The honest answer is that all of those things are true at different times and sometimes at the same time. I am not at war with him in my mind. He is a man who believed completely in a system he had never questioned, and who, when his daughter did not fit that system, did the thing that system required of him. He is also a man who drove to a house where his daughter was living and sat in the yard for 45 minutes and did not knock on the door. I think about that a great deal. I think about what it cost him to drive there, and what it cost him to leave without knocking, and whether those two costs added up to more than the cost of knocking would have been, or less. I do not know. I was not there for the calculation. I am not simply angry. I want to be precise about this. There are things about what happened to me and to people like me that produce in me a feeling that is anger, or is at least anger adjacent. The education system that left me functionally locked out of the credential economy until I was in my mid-20s. The documentation situation that made the first 2 years after leaving significantly harder than they needed to be, and that was, as I said, by design. The watching that was done to Daniel, and the thing that was done to Jonas's message before it reached me, and the thing that was done to Mary Byler's face between who she was and who she was performing at her own wedding. These things produce in me a feeling that is not peace, but the specific anger that people seem to be looking for. The righteous fury at a system that wronged me personally. The desire to expose, or punish, or dismantle is more complicated than the simple version of it. Because the system that shaped me is the same system that shaped my mother, who I love. It is the same system that shaped my father, who I believe was trying to be a good person by its standards, even when those standards required him to do things that I experienced as harm. It is the system that shaped my older brother Aaron and my sister Ruth, and my younger sisters, whose names I am not going to use here, and who are living their lives within it as best they can. I cannot be simply and cleanly angry at the system without being angry at the people the system made, and the people the system made are not simply or cleanly bad. They are people. They are people I came from. What I have instead of simple anger is something more like a commitment to telling the truth about what it was. Not the dark story where everything inside was evil, not the warm story where it was only my personal weakness that made it feel wrong, not the redemption story where leaving solved everything. The true story, which is that a community can be beautiful and broken at the same time. That the same system that gave my mother her sense of meaning and her community and her life also gave her a daughter she cannot speak to freely. That the bishop who told my father I would be dead was wrong about the prediction, and correct that leaving would cost me things I have not fully finished grieving. Both are true, and I am not interested in resolving them into anything simpler than they are. I am alive. That is my answer to the bishop's prediction. Not a refutation, not a revenge story. Just the fact. I am alive. I made it out, and the world on the other side of the ridge is real, and I am in it. My younger sisters are grown now. One is married within the community. One left the year after I did, a fact I learned through the network, which had connected us without either of us seeking the connection, and which had produced between us a careful and fragile correspondence that is the closest thing to a relationship with my family of origin that I have. We are not close in the way people who share a childhood are usually close. We are close in the way survivors of the same event who ended up in different places are sometimes close, carefully, with significant gaps, with more unsaid than said, but with something genuine underneath all of it that I hope continues. The network that Sarah built is larger now than it was when I called from the end of the road. She has helped more than 30 women leave their communities in the years since I first sat in her kitchen. Some of those women are still in contact with her. Some are not. Some went back. Most did not. All of them made the choice they had the information and resources and courage to make at the moment they made it, and I do not know how to judge any of them for any of it, because I know what the choice costs from the inside, and I know that the inside is the only place from which the cost can be accurately assessed. What I know is this: the bishop was wrong. You can leave and survive. You can build a life in the English world that is your own and that nobody gave you and that nobody can take from you, because the taking would require you to give it up voluntarily, and you are not going to do that. You can call your mother from a coffee shop 3 states from where you were born and cry into your coffee and then order another one and keep going. You can survive the thing that was designed to make survival feel impossible. Some of those children are still leaving anyway. I hope every single one of them finds a woman in a dark blue car who arrives in 37 minutes and makes tea when they get there and does not ask questions until they are ready to answer them. And I hope they know, the way I needed to know and nobody was there to tell me, that the bishop was wrong. He has always been wrong. And you are not going to die within a year. You are going to be okay.